Great. Good morning, everybody. I'm here to introduce this webinar today, our March 18th Dropout Prevention webinar series. The last three episodes were all on multi-tiered systems of support. We're focusing the next three on engagement. Today we have Ron Hertel and Mary Wilson joining us. They'll be talking about practices in elementary school, trauma-informed practices sort of related to the Compassionate Schools initiative. But before they start, I wanted to just talk a little bit about engagement, give it a little start. There we go. When we talk about engagement, we talk about that a lot. There's a lot of different programs and federal programs, initiatives in districts, all sorts of rules about that require engagement. Sort of trying to, OSPI is doing work right now trying to get all of us to understand what does engagement mean and who are we talking about with engagement. Briefly, we'll just be talking about engaging students so that they are, because engaged students stay in school, engaging staff to help support the students, engaging families, making them part of the learning process, and engaging communities and understanding that we all have a stake to play in education. Briefly, we have done, Graduation and Team Effort has done some work talking about engagement. We've identified sort of two different buckets of essential elements of a comprehensive dropout prevention, intervention, and re-engagement system. And half of those buckets are systems sort of stuff, data, leadership, those kind of elements. And then half is about engagement, engaging students, engaging family and community. One of the things that we've talked about with engaged students is they have a sense of belonging in the school, they participate in school activities, they're provided power over their learning environment, they understand the relevance of what they are learning, and they're prepared to move on to the next step. Specifically today, we're going to be talking with Ron and Mary about compassionate trauma-informed schools, and thinking about that in connecting it to our last set of webinar topics on the multi-tier system of support. This is probably tier one, school-wide support for students, and we know that those, the better quality and more of those you have, the less problems you're going to have with tier 2 and tier 3 students. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ron and Mary to introduce themselves and talk to us about trauma-informed schools. Ron?
Good morning, Rhett. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here with you, and I love multi-tiered systems of support. I want to do just a little bit of introduction for each of us before we start. First of all, Rhett, I'm assuming you can hear me?
You bet.
Okay, thank you. So I'm a program supervisor at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, and my charge is student mental health and well-being. In addition to that, we started the Compassionate Schools Initiative in 2008, and I have had the distinct pleasure over the last 7 years or so of working with Dr. Mary Wilson. She was the principal at Manitou Park Elementary School in Tacoma School District, and she very willingly raised her hand and said she would be willing to be one of our first pilot projects for compassionate schools, and she continues to do really excellent work in that field today. She's moved to a different school now, and I'll let her tell you about that. Part of my charge is I work with a lot of our different systems. I'm a member of our Systems of Care group, which is really a SAMHSA grant that is spearheaded out of the Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery. I do a lot of work with the ACEs and Private and Public Services Initiative that's happening out there with a lot of philanthropic organizations. There's the Essentials of Childhood and a number of ways that we're sort of getting this work out there. So as we begin to talk about this, this is not one system, schools, but a multitude of systems, and we hope to demonstrate that as we walk through this today. Mary?
Yes, I'm Mary Wilson, and I was, like Ron said, the former principal at Manitou Park for over 7 years, and I'll talk a little bit more about
Next
that.
slide, Brett. Go ahead. Why don't you move to the next slide? Sorry.
Currently, I'm at Fernhill Elementary School, but we've continued the practices of compassionate schools, and I got so involved in it that I did my dissertation on compassionate schools, creating trauma-sensitive schools. So we're continuing the work with compassionate schools.
Great. So we're really glad to be here. In 2009, for those of you who may not know, we in the learning and teaching support section in student support right now wrote a book entitled The Heart of Learning and Teaching, Compassion, Resiliency, and Academic Success. And that book, it's a 246-page document that is available as a free download. You can see here at the bottom of the screen the link to get to that book. There's also an 11-minute video so you can get a better sense for what is happening in our schools with regard to this program. So I'm assuming this PowerPoint will be available to you afterwards, and so you can take that address down later. Next slide, Rhett, please. So as we begin to think about schools and the job of schools and what schools need to do, I really love the task force on education of young adolescents, which is school systems are not responsible for meeting every need of their students, but when the need directly affects learning, the school must meet the challenge. We began work under the GATE committee, and I know that GATE is the graduation and team effort at OSPI. And so much of the focus when we begin to talk about dropouts has to do with older kids who are in middle school and in high school. And a lot of times we don't think of how we want our kids to behave later on in life. What we need to do is to be able to address that deficits or be able to coach them or be able to encourage them a lot earlier in life. In the business community, productivity is generally predicated on knowing that engaging the customer is a priority, and engagement is absolutely vital to the business's success. The same can be said for our children. We can teach them habits of engagement from beginning at the earliest possible intersection between them and their schools. We think there's an awful lot that kids can do, that schools can do in terms of helping kids stay engaged, feel their self-esteem, feel their self-worth, and their general well-being can be supported. Next slide. So we all kind of think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Many of us know about this. Anybody who works in the health and education field has seen this. We just think it's really important that if kids are going to learn, which actually is the fifth rung up this pyramid, where it talks about cognitive needs, they have to have their physiological needs, their safety needs, their belonging and love needs, and their esteem, how they feel about themselves. Those all have to be met to some level in order for the brain to really be freed up enough in order to learn. Next slide. We, in the Compassionate Schools Initiative, do a lot about neurobiology. We think it's really important for people to begin to understand from a foundational practice about a little bit about brain development, how adolescent brains, children's brains develop, and what happens when you introduce trauma into that brain development process, and then how that impacts learning. One of the things that we've learned in our lives is that experiences that we've had, especially those earlier in our lives, begins to determine how our brain network begins to function. It shapes, it prunes, it reinforces that which we've already learned, and as we reach maturity, those things become more set in stone. The adversity and traumas and anxieties that we experience in our life can absolutely activate systems prematurely and make our brains much more responsive and sensitive to future stressors. So a lot of kids are functioning in school under the fight, flight, or freeze mode. There's actually a fourth one now to that, which is the faint mode, where they just sort of check out completely. And we begin to look at that and realize that if a kid is functioning in that way, feeling like they're being pursued by a saber-toothed tiger or some malevolent force, that the ability for them to learn is going to be severely compromised. Next slide. We began a lot of this work in 2000, and well, it actually was sparked in 2007 when Dr. Robert Anda from the Centers for Disease Control came from Atlanta, Georgia, and presented some work on a relatively new study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Many people in the state of Washington are now familiar with that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But it was a very statistically significant study in which over 17,000 patients from Kaiser Permanente, and the other co-principal investigator of that was Dr. Vincent Folletti. He was the medical director at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, California, and really wanted to answer some questions about how the impact of our stressors in our life impact overall health. So they really looked at it from an epidemiological standpoint. They were stunned at what they learned. There were 9, next slide please, 9 adverse childhood experiences, which will show up here in the next slide, that they originally studied. Now they are going to be looking at 10. If you look at number 4, neglect, you see that it is divided into emotional and physical. So as they're beginning to do the study, the Department of Health, the Foundation for Healthy Generations, and all that are very, very involved in terms of mitigating the effects of ACEs in adults' lives and with kids as well. And so we're beginning to partner with the Department of Health, the Department of Social and Health Services, and all of the agencies out there that are trying to address the issue of adverse childhood experiences and health outcomes. Next slide. So we've learned a lot in terms of how this affects the classroom. In the year 2010, we took the results of the Healthy Youth Survey. Next slide, Rhett. Thanks. These are some of, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, these are some of the indicators of what happens to people under a great deal of epidemiological effects of high levels of ACEs in our lives, so won't spend a lot of time on this one. Let's go to the next slide, please. What we've learned is that not the severity of any one of the ACEs that is the biggest predictor of challenge, but rather the number of those 9 ACEs that you carry in your life. This is a slide that came from the Family Policy Council. They did some great work back in 2010 where they paired the Healthy Youth Survey and the Adverse Childhood Experiences questionnaire and brought some of the questions from the Healthy Youth Survey and correlated those with the adverse childhood experiences to sort of get a sense for how prevalent ACEs were in our classroom. Some of the work that was being done showed pretty significantly that if you carried 3 or more of the adverse childhood experiences in your life and were impacted by those, that the ability to learn was compromised. There was some definite effect on a child's ability to absorb information by having to worry about other things that were going on in their lives through the adverse childhood experiences. So how prevalent was that? So if we know there's an academic impact at 3 ACEs, how many of our kids in the classroom have 3 ACEs, for example? This study showed, and we had probably about 100,000 kids in grades 10 and 12 in the year 2010 that participated in this study. We're showing that 13 out of 30 kids in a classroom had more than 3 ACEs in their lives. And so we began to look at the prevalence of this and the impact, potential impact in the classroom, and realizing that 43% of the kids in our classroom were having some issue in terms of their ability to learn. Therefore, schools needed to think about some ways to consider that. Next slide. One of the things that adversity does in our life is it triggers some of our neurotransmitters or hormonal structures inside to fire. And adrenaline and cortisol, all very helpful substances that our body produces and whatnot. Adrenaline and cortisol, particularly adrenaline, is neurotransmitters that can help us get out of danger. It basically reprograms where the blood flows, and it takes the blood from the brain and puts it into your legs and limbs, so that if you're being chased by something, I guess going back to primitive time and brainstem development, is to be able to escape the danger that's happening to you. This is produced whether or not we truly are in danger, only if the perception that we have is in danger. And so we began to realize that kids who were constantly under stress are continually producing these high doses of adrenaline and cortisol into their body as a response to what they're feeling, even though they may or may not truly be in danger. The persistence of that in their lives absolutely has an effect on developing brain cells. And there's been a lot of scientific proof now that the brain matter in a child who lives under chronic stress against that of a child who doesn't live under chronic stress, that there's actually a physiological difference in the actual weight of the brain. And therefore, we are seeing the effects of cortisol and adrenaline in the lives of these developing brains as being pretty detrimental. Great when we need it in those emergent situations, but in continuous doses, it does actually do damage. And so this slide basically, we're trying to help educators to understand that a child who's under persistent trauma or adversity will cause the brain to be underdeveloped or damaged by introducing these substances that should be used only in emergency situations into our brains all the time. So if we can help our teachers to understand that a lot of times the behavior of a child is being guided by those things that are happening to them internally, that their behavior may be much more reflexive than reflective. In terms of that, teachers can a lot of times begin to have a deeper understanding for the children that they're teaching or that they're working with in some ways. And we think that if that occurs and teachers can develop a different sense for who these children are and what they're going through, that we can begin to approach these children differently in a much more helpful and healing sort of way. Next slide, please. So we think that that importance is very foundational for a lot of the evidence-based practices that are out there. We think it's really important to understand that if you're looking at 30 children in a classroom, you basically have 30 representatives of 30 different family systems who are coming together into a classroom and all interacting with each other, and the teacher has to manage those sorts of interactions. Kids who live in trauma and anxiety at home oftentimes are easily triggered by things that happen in a classroom, things that people say, looks that other kids give, and these are all just ways that kids are learning to survive. The other thing that we think is really important about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study is that it's really important to build our own awareness as helping professions, as teaching professions, that our own constellation of adverse childhood experiences in our life, if we've not had a square look at that, if we've not done a very good self-assessment in terms of how that's impacted our own lives, and that we've done what we can to mitigate that, we're likely to have a reaction to a student rather than a response to a student by something that they've done. I oftentimes say in the training that I've done is that if you've got an unresolved issue in your life and you have not identified it, if you walk into a classroom of children, they'll help you find it. And they'll push those buttons in a way that oftentimes you cannot imagine. And so having that under your belt in a way that you can feel that you're in control of that is a very good thing for a teacher to have. Next slide. One of the things that I think there are three things that we really want kids to have in a classroom. And I think Mary will back me up on this when she presents here in a moment. But self-regulation is an important element. Some of our kids grow up, they get to be adolescents, and that self-regulation has still not been something they've been able to grab hold of in their life. And the self-regulation is that ability to sort of reflect on what's just happened to you. You have some choices in terms of how you respond. The brain structure in terms of how our brains develop, the neocortex, which is sort of the governing part of the brain. We have the middle brain, which is the emotional part of our brain. If we haven't developed that upper part of our brain sufficiently, a lot of times that middle part of the brain, when it gets out of control, is very difficult to soothe. Therefore, we try to help children to build the neural connections in that upper part of the brain to build that self-regulation, that self-control, that ability to calm themselves. We do that through mindful activities, through some of the yoga calm, which Mary has done a lot in her school. And our ultimate goal is to try to get kids to be resilient. And resilience is basically the capacity to rise above difficult circumstances. They allow our children to exist in less than a perfect world, because that is the world we live in, while they can move forward with some hope and optimism and confidence in their lives. The work of Dr. Kenneth Ginsburg certainly underscores this a lot, and if we can do something to help children build resilience in their life, they will definitely have a much better shot at being successful in the world. Next slide, please. So we really, one simple slide that we've used a lot has really resonated a lot with teachers more than any other slide, and I think this is one of them. And that's if we can just sort of shift that idea from what's wrong with you, which is a question that sometimes when we had those moments where we did something not so smart when we were kids, we might have had that question asked of us. But kids who have been under consistent trauma in their life, if they find that there's an adult that is genuinely interested in them, an adult who regards their well-being and their best interest, they will take the time to get to know them. There are many examples of this out there that we see over and over again from children who have been through trauma, and when an adult takes an interest and listens to a child and talks to a child and gives that child a little bit of attention, and it doesn't even have to be a lot, even a couple minutes, that can make all the difference in the world. So resilient students really need resilient teachers. So that resilience piece to that is really important. Next slide, basically we'll go through a sequence of resilience that in our work that we're doing, that the classroom with the number of principles and domains that we teach to in our book is really important. Altruism is a great way for kids to sort of feel participatory. We've heard about the we activities that are happening. Some of the schools in Washington State have done that, but it's definitely a part of the sequence of resilience. If we look at first at we need to survive, when we figure out the wrong that has happened to us, that we have to adapt, we figure out what to do with that, we finally accept where we're at in our life. Through that and through continuing processing of that and understanding that better, we grow stronger. But then where our strength is really shoots up is when we can turn that into an altruistic sort of way of helping others. So that's a really important thing. Cynthia Leitz, assistant professor at Arizona State University, really put this sequence together very well. The next slide is very important to us. In the book that we wrote, we very deliberately put it as Chapter 2, not as the last chapter in the book, but Chapter 2. It is about self-care, about how we who are teachers, who are therapists, who work with people, we sort of coined it as an ethical obligation for those who care. We think it's absolutely ethical for you to think about yourself and taking care, putting on your own oxygen mask, if you will. And so our second chapter of the book really deals with that. Next slide, please. What we're really after a lot in the work that we're doing is compassion satisfaction. Very few of us, I would venture to say none of us, went into teaching because we think we could make a lot of money at it. We're into it because it's a labor of love, it's something we believe in, it's something we're committed to, and we're interested in helping people live better lives. That makes us ultimate candidates for compassion fatigue. Vicarious trauma is that ability to absorb some of the pains and the troubles of others, and we begin to feel those ourselves. We might feel sleepless nights, we might be more irritable, we might have it impact our social interactions. And lastly, burnout. We want to be very careful that we preserve ourselves in the work as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's really important is to really understand that we're not in this by ourselves. No matter whether you're a school or your community, Chapter 4 of our book really sort of spells it out by building compassionate school and community partnerships that work. There's outreach in the schools. We heard about a terrific program the other day called the Eagles Club program at First Creek Middle School in the Tacoma School District that's run by the YMCA, where they have tremendous outreach into the community. And full-service community schools was an idea that was put forth by Joy Dreyfus, the late Joy Dreyfus from the state of New York, who really looked at schools as sort of the hub of the community. Many times I have community members come up to me and say, I would really love to get involved with their school, but I really don't know how to approach them or where to go. And schools sometimes are not the best at making that invitation very apparent for community members to be involved. I think this has to be an incredibly intentional activity on the parts of schools to do outreach into the community, but not only the community, also into the families to act as partners. Next slide. Basically kind of says it all. It says schools can't do it alone, and even if they could, they probably shouldn't, because communities are interested in building strong and positive citizens for the future of that community. Allowing them to have a voice in this and to make education a multifaceted partnership event is just going to strengthen all of that extremely well. So the last part, the last slide that I'm going to cover here today is on family support and the importance of families and how families are sometimes an overlooked resource. I think that we have oftentimes stood at the threshold of asking families to get involved, and we said, that's not enough. Let's get them engaged. That's not enough. And so we actually like to take this to the next level of parent leadership opportunities, where you can actually have parents come in. Next slide, Brett, please. Where you actually can have parents come in and teach other children, share their cultures, share their experiences, share their professions, get involved in school. And I think it's really important when we're having parents get involved is to find out what they love to do and use that as your resource base rather than trying to have a parent fill a specific job. There's a lot of richness involved in saying, what would you like to do for us, and then let them be creative around that. And I just encourage all sorts of creativity. So we realized with the ACEs and all that there was a tremendous deficit out there. Next slide. That we needed to do something. So in 2008, with the help of the School Transformation Grant, we began something called the Compassionate Schools Initiative, sort of built off of what Massachusetts had done in trauma-sensitive schools. We were encouraged by them not to call it trauma-sensitive schools because it sends a bad message to parents thinking that they're going to send their children to a school that's filled with traumatized children, rather than a school that's more set to deal with the kind of stresses and struggles that all children deal with all the time. It's about climate and culture, and I think Mary Wilson has done an incredible job in her school of bringing that in, and I'm really glad she's here to share her story today.
Next slide. Yeah, thank you. Probably this was one of the most pivotal undertakings in my career, coming into a school that had a lot of challenges. But first we wanted to establish what is a compassionate school, and what basically, it's not a program, but it goes together about facing and realizing the things that you need in your school. It's a school where the staff and the students learn to be aware of the challenges that are faced by others, and they respond to the physical and social, academic and emotional challenges that the students face and their families, and offering that support and guidance in removing those barriers so that they have the ability to learn. Next slide. In the book, we use this book quite a bit in my school and in the school I am now. And basically, it goes through how we teach and what we teach. How we teach is we always try to empower students, not disempower them. We provide them that unconditional positive regard. And one of the things that sometimes people get confused about with the compassionate schools is that they think, well, you have to lower your expectations. No, you have to maintain your high expectations. Otherwise, you're saying the children aren't worth it. You have to check your assumptions about families. How do you feel about families that come into your school. Also, to become, I think one of the most powerful things is the relationships that you build with your families and your students and your staff. And then provide guided opportunities. What that does is basically give them a purpose. And what we use, what was called meaningful work, and give the students assignments and work within the schools outside of this, their academics. And what we teach is in the domain 1 and 2 and 3 is we want to make sure that we provide a safe environment. We teach emotional and behavioral expectations and self-regulation, and also the competencies of personal agency, social skills, and the academics. Next slide. Probably one of the most important things that we found was that the key points in the Compassionate Schools is that it benefits all students, including those who are affected by trauma. We also wanted to make sure that we lived what we do, and that is we put it in our school plan and then our improvement plans. The school leadership has to be engaged. If they don't have that belief system, it's very difficult for it to be successful. And the ACES content changes the assumptions that we had. It helped us learn. For instance, I had one teacher who had been there for quite a while, and I thought she would be the most difficult one to engage in this or have change her belief system. And when she went through this training, she literally stood up and said, "Oh, now I understand why he acts the way he does." And to me, that was really powerful. Again, it's a process. It's not a program. It goes to fit with what your school is doing and the needs of your school and your families and your students. Next slide. Just to give you a little bit of background, the demographics at Manitou Park, we have African American was 38%, Hispanic 20%, and Caucasian white was 26%. At that time, we had between 84 and 90% free and reduced lunch. The program ran from pre-K to 5th grade with 620 students. My understanding now, this year, it's almost 670 students.
Wow.
Yeah. Next slide. So why did Manitou Park participate in this project? I came to Manitou Park in 2006, and before we got engaged in the Compassionate School initiative, I was astounded at, and I had been working overseas, and I came back, and I found the school in desperation in a lot of ways. There was very little parent involvement. People who entered the office usually were very angry and disenfranchised. Within the school population, there was an atmosphere of disrespect. People, there's great staff, but they were living in their silos. I received death threats from parents, from some of them community members. We had a murder in our play yard. We had regular gang fights during the school day. We had a very high level of disciplinary actions and suspensions. And the go-to was usually, if there was problems, was to go to special education and special education referrals. A lot of students were hypervigilant, violent, distractible, very behind academically, and there was some severe receptive and expressive communication problems. Next slide. So you can see it was a little bit overwhelming those first couple of years, so we were looking for something. And when I did get a phone call that summer of 2008, after living through a lot of these things for the last couple of years, they said, "Mary, would you like to be involved in the Compassionate School initiative?" And before she could what it was about, I said yes. because I saw the need. So why we got involved in it, we wanted to bring about mainly the changes in teachers' perceptions and attitudes and behavior and actions towards children that are affected by trauma. We had this mantra called pride, perseverance, respect, integrity, discipline, and empathy, but I didn't see it being practiced. Next slide. We know that our students need high standards, a sense of empowerment, boundaries and structures, authentic choices, and a sense of control, and support between that transition of home and school. Often that was very, very muddied. Next slide. So what did we get involved in? What did we immerse ourselves in? First, with ACEs and the potential effects on student learning. We attended conferences, the Partnership of Hope. We did looked at brain research that Ron had talked about earlier. We got real in depth in it, and about loss, abuse, and neglect, and how it affects the brain. So then, but then we were looking at, okay, now what do we do? So we looked at what are some solutions, how can we help? We adopted a common curriculum and common strategies. We also had some training on resiliency, and also I could really see in myself and in others is the compassion fatigue over those couple of years were really starting to take their toll. So we need to do something about that and recognize those stressors. Next slide. I think engaging in the compassion fatigue training was very empowering to my staff, because it basically said, I'm giving myself permission to take care of myself. And it became a very, like I said, a very powerful thing for them. During my dissertation, one of the things that I kept surfacing was about trauma and self-regulation, and how important that was for a lot of our students who had difficulty even attending in class, knowing the routines, and how those ACEs affected their ability to regulate emotions and executive functions. A lot of the students are operating on a high level of arousal and fear. As Ron had talked about, they were in a survival mode, whether it was real or not real. And he talked about the fight, flight, freeze. This is often one of those they would resort to. I had many students that would take off running because they had the inability to regulate, or they had that, whether it was real or not, sense of fear. And then often they cannot communicate the way they need to tell you, you know what, I'm in this state, I can't handle this. So they would act it out. Next slide. The teaching of the self-regulation was probably a very, very powerful thing also. So what I did was, in my studies, was in order to self-regulate, a child must recognize and identify their own feelings, connect to those feelings to experience, read emotional cues of others, and be able to express that and those emotional experiences, and recognize and adjust to the shifts of emotions, and be able, how can I bring myself back? We had little calming areas in the classroom so that students could go if they were in that state of arousal. We found that we identified when some of our students would be set off, and one of the areas that we found that was in transitional times. So we taught transitional times. What does it look like to go to music? What does it look to go to PE? What does it look at recess? What are the expectations? Sometimes we take those for granted, but a lot of our students needed to be taught those things. Next slide. So we never took any of that for granted. So one of the things that Ron was talking about also was we had to bring our community in to our school and let them know that this is a safe place, a loving place, a compassionate place to be. So we provided places like and activities like community game night and other activities so that the parents would feel welcome. We saw a tremendous change in our parent involvement. One of the things that we did was that my first year there in the music program, winter program, usually that's where everybody comes. What I found out was there was only, at that time, 25 people showed up. And what we saw, and you can turn to the next slide, what we saw a change in after the 2 years in working with Compassionate Schools, we saw our students' families show up for the winter program. Over 1,000 people showed up. So it showed us that we had provided that opportunity for people to come and feel welcome.
That's great outreach.
The other is one of the things that attitudes and perceptions are changing is that often it was very difficult to take some of our teachers away from prescriptive programs. And one of the things that we needed to do is get and where I'm very involved with studying about growth mindsets. And one of the things that I saw that our staff did was believe that our students could operate at a higher level thinking skills. So we introduced inquiry by design, and it was very successful. We emphasized student voice and engagement. We also tracked our students as far as really looking carefully at our data. And the results that we saw were quite impressive in 4th grade. Reading went up 20% in 2000. Things that I was most proud of. Also, we saw our 5th grade go up in science. Next slide. So I'll just review teachers in compassionate schools use attentive listening and speaking to students, big solutions, know that learners cannot meet academic goals until the most basic human needs are met physically and emotionally. And this comes from the book, which I think is awesome. You cannot teach the mind until you reach the heart. And we believe that all our students are supported to achieve high academic goals. Next slide.
That's our former vice principal in the background, by the way.
Yeah. It was a team effort, definitely. These are just some of the excerpts of the quotes that the staff said after we finished all our training. I'll just let you look through that, but one of the ones that I think was very powerful, I believe we are looking at our students through different eyes, realizing there might be a reason for their outbursts. Looking at how we view kids and how we treat them individually, starting to show more understanding of what might be happening to them.
So I think that's the last slide that we have to present. It looks like we might be having some technical issues here. Rhett, I'm going to turn it kind of back over to you right now to facilitate any questions that the audience might have here about some of the work we've done. This is a very fast overview. Can't begin to capture the wonderful work that Mary's done at Manitou Park. And if you can hear me, I'll wait for you to chime in.
Okay, I'm here. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. We just wanted you guys to have some moment to think about, introspect for a minute.
Oh, there you go. That was brilliant to build that in like that.
Yeah.
We have a question for the field is, do you have something similar for high school programs?
Well, we do. We have high school programs. We work with all. I think the general knowledge about trauma, the adverse childhood experience, and getting that information for teachers, whether you're middle school or whether you're elementary or high school, it all affects how you treat the students. We do very strong student engagement programs with Compassion in Schools for the high school. We do some other kind of activities, writing-based activities. We do some of the mindfulness and the yoga practices or those self-calming things for kids. By the time they get into high school, we really want to look at that third domain, which is really the domain of building executive function. So we're doing things, neural connections are still building in high school. So kids come to us damaged in middle school or from elementary school and they haven't gotten a handle on that. There's still time. It just gets a little harder the older the children or we get in order to make those necessary changes. But neural connections are happening all the time. The plasticity is a new concept in terms of thinking about how brains can heal themselves. So yes, high schools are absolutely not lost, and we do have programming specific to high schools as well.
Nice. I think that that brings up that aspect too of a dropout prevention, intervention, and re-engagement system needs to be, early learning through high school. It's not a high school solution. We need to build these initial steps in there at the elementary school, at the early learning stages. Catch
One of the
early.
things when we used to run the Readiness to Learn program out of student support, we had a program called Read and Play, and we actually had women who had not even given birth yet who were coming to that because they wanted to kind of get a jump start on parenting. And so it starts even prenatally for people and parents beginning to build those relationships with schools. Mary talked a lot about transitions between classes. Kids' lives are filled with transitions. You go from home to preschool, preschool to kindergarten, kindergarten to first grade, elementary to middle, middle to high school. In a high school, you're on your own. Kids need support, especially in every one of those transition stages in their life. So the earlier we get there, the easier the transitions become for them.
One of the things that we try to emphasize in the elementary school is attendance and tardiness. And what we say to parents is that sends a message to the child about how important school is. In fact, there is research out there about attendance in elementary school and how it affects them in high school. So we start there about how important it is to tell the students, to tell your child getting to school on time, and attending regularly.
Right. That's a great point. We've talked about that several times in this series about the early warning indicators, all of those things, and how attendance, especially in, we've got the ABCs of attendance, behavior, and coursework, grades and stuff. And in grade school, elementary school, attendance is a big indicator. There's a lot of ups and downs on behavior and coursework, but attendance is a big key behavior, and engaging that family and them understanding the value of attendance, because they're in charge of getting the kids to school at that age. High school kids, they have a little more control in their life, but at grade school, getting that family engaged, and if they're engaged in the school, they're able to demonstrate that there is value in school, and the kids need to be there. Another question we have.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Another question is, do you have ideas for building resiliency in older students?
Yeah, I really think that, I have to say right now, I'm personally a big fan, and Mary, I'm going to turn to you in a second to think about that too, because I'm personally a big fan of mindfulness training and helping kids to be present. I think in our fast-paced society, those of us who are older are immigrants into the digital world. Kids who grew up with that or whatnot, there's a whole different way of socially interacting and whatnot, and we've sort of lost touch with our own personal awareness. And so a lot of the mindfulness practices are really very helpful for kids in school. If you're interested in that, there's a website out there called mindfulschools.org. It's out of Oakland, California, and they've got some great ideas about how to sort of bring that into the classroom. For kids who are not self-regulated very well, it's a great training tool for them to be able to quiet themselves. A lot of teachers are saying, can I borrow some of that practice as well for myself? It's a very centering kind of thing. So that's one thing. A lot of the writing to build resilience is how you teach children to look at their life experiences. There are some playwriting classes. There's other writing exercises that kids are doing in terms of putting digital storyboards together to really be able to look at what's happened in their lives, building groups, as much student leadership as possible, and giving those responsibilities where it says meaningful opportunities, principle number 6 for engagement. I would, as a school, in a high school especially, as much of the rein as you can hand to the students, I would really encourage. Mary, what are your thoughts?
I think probably one of the most powerful things that I've seen, and I've seen that my students that left me and came back that were being successful in middle school and high school, was that relationship that they built with their teacher and they built with me, in knowing that how much I cared about them, and it went outside of the classroom and the building's doors. They knew it was extended. They knew I cared about their families. I cared about how well they did in school. The other thing I think is powerful. We had some students that would come back and work in our schools. Again, it's back to that giving them meaningful work and a sense of purpose and a sense of responsibility that, we're counting on you to show up and be a mentor. We're counting on you to fulfill this job responsibility. So I think you build the resilience in them because, yes, they're being successful. And one of the things that one of my teachers said this year that I thought was so powerful was, I have been in the habit of praising the product and not the effort. And I think that that's what we need to do, is continue to praise that effort towards the things they want to accomplish, not the end result, but relationships and meaningful work and sense of purpose.
That altruism that we saw in Charlotte Leet's or Cynthia Leet's resilience piece there, where you get to give back and you get to be a role model for somebody else, whether you're a parent or whether you're a student, that sort of engagement it's worth its weight in gold.
Okay, well, a lot of what I heard today, I don't know if I already said this, was the sort of the compassionate trauma-informed practices. They're there to address those barriers to student engagement. You know, providing more and more opportunities for student engagement might not be the best solution if your kids are unable to engage because of their past traumatic experiences. And so understanding, you know, addressing those initial barriers rather than coming up with more solutions is often.
I think it's important, too, to engage kids where they are. And we have to really be attuned to the needs of kids. You know, a lot of times a kid who's distressed is not going to let you know that. There's a lot of secrets that go on in the lives of students who are living in difficult circumstances. I mean, domestic violence is one of those, and certainly the sexual trafficking that goes on. Those are big secretive worlds, and teachers have to be so vigilant about attunement to kids in those circumstances.
Yeah, I thought that was, you know, that was part of one of the things that you guys mentioned also was the fear survival mode, whether it was real or not real, and a lot of, you know, looking at the Healthy Youth Survey, you know, we see students saying, you know, that they don't feel safe in school, they don't have protective factors, and a lot of the schools push back on that because, you know, they feel like they do provide those, but it's that whole aspect of it's that student's perception, you know, whether it's real or not real, that needs to get addressed rather than the other end.
But taking a kid, you know, like, oh, well, you shouldn't be scared, it's not going to take a fear away. To be able to take a little bit of time to dig deeper, but I really want to underscore what Mary said earlier about the positive relationship that we have, that kids rely on that. If you come from a home where you don't have strong relationship with your family, and a lot of our kids are pretty estranged from their family, that relationship in school, I mean, I think if we were sitting in an open room and I could see all of your faces right now and asked you to raise your hand if the teacher had a significant impact on your life, we see most hands going up almost all the time. So we just can't underestimate how important that relationship factor is.
I would love to keep talking about this. There's a few more points I would like to bring up, but we are unfortunately out of time. So I wanted to thank Ron and Mary for presenting this. If anybody out there has any more questions, please feel free to email me, teameeffort@k12.wa.us. Or, and then this webinar will be posted. The video of it will go on YouTube. The rest of it will go on our website, the GATE website. And the next webinar is scheduled for next month, April 15th. It continues along talking about engagement. We have a speaker lined up. I don't remember who that is right now. And but in the meantime, we would also love to hear about your specific processes that you use to engage students, families, staff, and community, as well as measures. You know, how do you measure that any of these efforts are being successful? It's engagement is such an interesting topic, and we're trying to figure out how we can quantify what's successful and what's not successful. And that, you know, we might not necessarily find specific answers, but I'd love to hear what you guys are using for that. And once again, the email address is teameeffort, like graduation, a team effort, teameeffort@k12.wa.us. Thanks everybody for joining.
And Rhett, they can go ahead and email us too. I just want to thank you for this time and the opportunity.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.